Do you ever wonder why some memories are easily recalled while others seem to fade away like drifting smoke? On this week's episode, we'll talk about a recent article that explores questions regarding sleep, memory, and reward. I'm Jay, and this is Somnilopod. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. One of the main reasons I started Somnilopod was to educate not only the public, but also to increase my own understanding of what happens when we're sleeping. And one of the ways I do that for myself is by reading articles from science journals. Now, the downside of that is that sometimes I have no idea what they're talking about. They are very, very clever people. So those scientists are much smarter than me. However, 9 times out of 10, I can usually get the gist of the article and enough to give myself a little bit of insight. So one article that I came across recently was from some very clever researchers from the University of Geneva in Switzerland. And the article was published in the journal Nature Communications on July 6th of this year. And the reason I like this article is because it reminds me of some questions that I would often get asked when I was working nights myself, doing the overnight sleep studies. And patients, as we were talking about, looking at the brain and the brainwave activity, patients would often ask, well, can you tell what I'm dreaming? Now, the voice of my 10-year-old self is very much alive and living in my brain. And he really, really wanted to answer that question every single time with yes. Yes, we can. But unfortunately, the answer is no, we cannot. At least not yet. And this brings us to the article. So the researchers asked the question, does reward for accomplishing a task assist in memory consolidation? Now, the reason we're talking about this on Somnilopod is because we know certain things about what happens with memory while we're sleeping. So, for example, we know that deep sleep helps us to consolidate memories. There is a structure within the brain called the hippocampus that is sort of in the temporal lobe, so it's sort of middle lower portion of the brain. And it helps to store memories during the day. And then it has a dialogue with those areas of the brain that the memories are stored in during the night when we go into deep stages of sleep, stage 3 sleep, for example. So while we cannot read the thoughts that are occurring, we can see what parts of the brain are active during certain types of tasks. So, for example, facial recognition, being able to look at one person and determine that they are not the person standing next to them. That occurs in a very specific part of the brain. In addition, spatial memory or spatial relation, being able to navigate a room or a house, for example, that also occurs in a separate part of the brain from facial recognition. So what these researchers did, they wanted to look at some tasks regarding both of those types of behaviors. And they wanted to look at the sections of the brain that lit up during those types of tasks. And they did this by using, or at least one technology that we have talked about in the past, the EEG, electroencephalogram. And that the electroencephalogram is just basically electrodes that are placed on the scalp that measure the electrical activity in the brain below the electrode, so we can see what's happening across the brain itself. They also used what's called a functional MRI or fMRI. That stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. Now, a lot of us have had an MRI in the past. It's that big tube that you sort of get slid into that is sometimes a little claustrophobic for some of us. But what it actually does with regard to the functional aspect and looking at brain research, it actually looks at the flow of blood to certain parts of the brain, because we do know that during certain tasks, the areas of the brain that are being activated require more oxygen, so they require more blood flow. So we can see, for example, during facial recognition, that area of the brain lights up with a functional MRI because we know that it is using more energy, so it needs to have a little more blood flow. So what they did, they took a group of volunteers and they had them perform these two separate tasks. One was a facial recognition task, a lot like that the game that we played when we were kids, Guess Who, where you would have this list of faces and your opponent would say, okay, she doesn't have green eyes. So you would flip down all the ones that didn't have or that had green eyes. So that would exclude those. They also had them do a spatial test where they went through on the computer a functional or a 3D maze. So they would go through the maze and try to find the exit. As I mentioned, both of these occurred in different parts of the brain. One additional thing they did that they didn't tell the test subjects was that the test was rigged. They could only succeed in half of the testing. And if you've ever been a part of any sort of like research in college, at the university, there's always something more happening. So you never know the full picture of why you're doing the test that you're doing. So what they did, they had half of the subjects able to succeed or to win the test, and the other half couldn't. And then after they had them perform these tasks while they were measuring the EEG and the functional MRI so they could see what was happening in those areas of the brain, then they had them sleep in the MRI. And they measured the MRI and the EEG during sleep. And what they found was fascinating. They found that during the deep stages of sleep, stage 3 sleep in particular, where we have a lot of big, slow waves of sleep, during that stage in particular, the hippocampus and the areas that these functional tests took place in or that they lit up during wake time, those areas also lit up again during sleep. So they knew that there was some sort of communication going on between the hippocampus and that area of the brain. Now, the interesting thing that they found was that those tests where they had reward, where they won the test, that was a lot brighter than it was when they didn't win the test. So then a couple of days later, they had these test subjects come back and they tested their memory of the test that they did, either the facial recognition or the spatial recognition. And they found that those that had the reward, again, had better memory consolidation. So they were actually able to look at the brain based on what was happening with those subjects and determine whether or not somebody was going to be able to remember something a little bit better, or that the likelihood was better that they would remember it than not. And I just think that is fascinating. You can check this article yourself, as I say, in Nature Communications from July 6th. It's from the University of Geneva in Switzerland. And I hope that this has been at least a little informative for you. I know it was for me. I really just dig stuff like this. So if you have any questions, or if you come across an article that you would like us to talk about, please forward it on to me at j@somnilopod.com. You can also touch base with me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And until we talk next time, get some rest. Thanks.